I don't know. I can't see you.
Hi.
Puneet, good evening.
Evening. How are you?
Very well. How's it going?
Good, good.
Gentlemen, we have quite a few ladies with us this evening. So thank you all for taking your time joining us this evening. Um, uh, uh, Before I get into the absolute formality of introducing Peter the way I would want to introduce Peter, Peter has been a friend, an acquaintance, a mentor from the industry to me. I met him during my days at Basel World when I was pretty much a novice, and I don't think I'm an expert now, but yes, probably I would know 1/4 of what Peter has spent his life doing. Um, so Peter comes to us today with his very, very new platform, The Naked Watchmaker, which is an educational platform that provides a unique insight into watchmaking. It is his creation, where Peter is the watchmaker and the photographer, together with Daniela Marin, who is the horological and logistical expert. Historically, Peter and Daniela founded Speake Marin watch brand. Uh, Incidentally, I'm wearing one of them this evening. Um, and they originally called it the Watch Workshop back in 2000. So Peter's horological journey began in 1985 at the Hackney Technical College in London, and after which he studied further in Switzerland at WASTEP in 1987. Those of you who don't know, WASTEP stands for Watchmakers of Switzerland Training and Educational Program. And to me, I think it's like a Harvard in the watchmaking world, where um, the watchmaker actually goes through 3,000 hours of practical bench training. And from 1987 to 1991, Peter was at WASTEP honing his skills. During his commercial career, he worked in the Oxford in after-sales service with brands such as Omega and Rolex. He also has a stint at Piaget as a watchmaker in London, New Bond Street. And over there, he developed he developed a restoration workshop in Piccadilly Arcade, which over the 6 years became one of the most respected restoration services in the world. Then by 1996, Peter moved to La Loc in Switzerland and worked for Renaud and Papi, which today, of course, is a part of Audemars Piguet, and in the production of modern and high quality complications. He then left from there and developed the workshop together with Daniela to provide services for assembly of complicated watch movements, design and project management. And of course, parallelly, they developed the brand Speake Marin, which was created in 2000. And the first watch collection out of that was launched at the Basel Watch Fair in 2002. Daniela started her career as a production scheduler for the BBC radio services in London, and continued in logistics scheduling cosmetics at Mary Kay Cosmetics, which is a Swiss manufacturing facility. Then after a short period of working at Piaget, where she scheduled the repatriation and shipping of stock, which was her first step into the career in the world of horology. By 2002, she officially joined Peter to develop the commercial side of Speake Marin brand. Today, she teams up with Peter once again to develop the Naked Watchmaker. In 2017, the Naked Watchmaker educational program was launched, offering a unique insight into the watchmaking industry, deconstructing photography, explaining and filming watches from small and large brands, antique and modern. Peter's site provides various amount of explanation of techniques, both historical and contemporary, that contribute into the watchmaking for a better understanding of the industry. He also interviews a lot of people who play a part in the watchmaking industry, bringing forth the message that the industry exists because of the people within it. Watchmakers, designers, company directors, through the retailers, journalists, bloggers, and even clients who finally buy watches can all be found on his website. The goal of Peter and the Naked Watchmaker is to inform and inspire future generations of watch lovers, collectors, giving everyone a unique insight into the timepieces and the horological industry from an objective and an educational purpose. So definitely we're going to have a very interesting evening ahead of us. Of course, watchmaking is a vast subject, extremely intricate. So with the small time frame that we have with the talented Peter, we will just be mainly concentrating on discovering the nuances of artisanal watchmaking, traditional versus modern techniques, primarily the differentiation between handwork and machine work, and the decorative arts on the movement. So I'm not going to delay you guys any further. I'm sure you're waiting to hear from Peter. So Peter, welcome. Thank you for joining us this evening, and I hand the platform over to you.
Thank you, Sarash. Hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to meet you all in this very obscure world we're presently living in. I would probably like to start by saying that nobody knows everything in this industry. It is extremely complex, and there are always variations, and there are always arguments against pretty much everything that can be stated. If ever you meet anybody, and I had this discussion with Sarash recently, if you ever meet somebody who says that they do know watchmaking in every depth, that's ego talking rather than reality, because it's impossible. I've been involved in this business for 35 years, and I love it. And one of the things that I love about it is the fact that you never see everything. It's impossible. Not only because of the variety of pieces that are being developed constantly in the present day, but there is so much diversity historically in watchmaking that it is an extraordinary, it's an extraordinary world. It's an extraordinary business, and it encompasses tens of different businesses, skills, crafts, whether we're talking technical, aesthetics, mechanics, it's kind of never ending. And the goal of the Naked Watchmaker is to try to delve as deeply into that and to show people all of the nuances within watchmaking, to ultimately to be able to show what is the difference between simply something which ticks and something which is a piece of art. And that is it's not an easy task, but it's kind of a mission that myself and Daniela have undertaken 3 years ago now. So before I go into the list of points that Sarash has requested that I cover, I just want to very quickly show you basically what are the table legs of the Naked Watchmaker. Can everybody see my screen, the Naked Watchmaker landing page? Yep.
Yeah, we can.
Okay, all right. So the core elements are shown on the principal site categories. So the deconstructions, explain how each individual product is effectively assembled or deconstructed, how it works. The making section, which is, I mean, as with every section is constantly growing, explains how the components or the dials or whatever goes towards making that final watch, that final product, how those pieces are actually made. It is an explanation that goes that step further beyond the deconstructions. The glossary helps to explain the terminology because it is a technical process, and it is very difficult to not use technical explanations when the whole process is actually being made. There are two elements which I'll quickly touch on. The random blog, which is just everything which is ancillary to watchmaking, and it can be anything from clocks to philosophy, and the links, which are just a means to be able to link people to all of the other resources that there exist in the world. The last one is the most important, and it's the people section. And in the people section, you have, again, as Sarash already mentioned, all of the people who play a part in some way in the industry, whether it is the final purchaser, whether it's the watchmaker, the designer, the artist. It's the people who make up the business. Without the people, nothing else exists. Therefore, therefore the people section is a means to be able to emphasize that which is the most important about the business, which are the people who actually construct it. There are 12 questions, and the 12 questions are the same, and they are posed to everybody, and pretty much everybody ends up giving a different answer. And that is, it's quite extraordinary now that we've actually had an incredible variety of people who have actually contributed to it. And next month, we publish 2 PDF books, which are free to download, that will actually encompass all of the people who have actually contributed over the last 3 years. So instead of going through the website, the whole thing can then be downloaded and viewed offline or in any other situation. So that comes out next month. So as a little push for that, if you sign on to the newsletter on the Naked Watchmaker, then all of these kind of updates, the free books or the new material, will then, you'll be notified by when we actually publish it. So I'm gonna jump over here. Okay, decoration. Sarash, can you see that? Sarash? Anybody?
Yes, of course. We can see you. We can see
No,
it.
no, okay. But you can see the decoration by hand, yeah?
Yes.
Okay, all right, okay. So it's really difficult to know where to begin and where to end with these subjects. So I've got to...
Let's address the most common terminology which normally people have known about, read about, maybe even taken a glance without actually realizing the in-depth aspect of it. So we'll address probably the Côte de Genève and the perlage, as they say, and probably we can, we can.
Okay, I'll just scroll down the page. What if we start with okay? I mean, the other big one is the angles.
Yes.
So what I'll do is I'll explain very quickly each element, and Sarash, please jump in if I do end up going down into the deep end. Okay, right. Taking the wrong color pill. Okay, so one of the elements which differentiates a high quality timepiece from a low quality timepiece is the decoration. And this is one of the things that differentiates watches from any other form of micromechanics, because so much of it is about the aesthetics, the feeling, the design, art, the beauty, the emotion, all of these things which are actually part of watchmaking, which you don't necessarily find in other areas. Okay, angling, it's simply where you break the edge or the corner between 2 flat surfaces. It can be done in a whole variety of ways. It's usually done, the initial process is done by machine, and then the woman who's in the picture here is using different wooden laps which are charged with different polishing compounds. And what she's doing, or what she will do, by holding the piece on a tool, a jig, like you see in this image, she will then polish polish the angle. When it is done entirely by machine, because some companies will not do it at all, which is much lower quality. Then you have kind of a mid quality where it's just done by machine. And then the angling can be done by diamond, so you still get a polished finish. And then you have it done by hand, where the angle is then cut by machine. And then afterwards, on that kind of jig that you see in front of you, you will then have all of the surfaces, the angled surface will then be polished using different either laps like you have here or small micromotors. The picture which is shown here, this is somebody who's actually angling between the corner juncture between two angles. So that is something which actually has to be, which is quite meticulous. It takes quite a long time to execute. So the person is actually working under microscope using small buffs, and each of the buffs, the wooden sticks that the person is actually holding, they have different gradients of polishing paper. And right now, the green one that they're holding is a very fine one. And as they actually drag that over the material, it will end up polishing the piece.
So, Peter, one quick question that we have from the audience. Viranchi is asking that, is angling the same as making a chamfer?
Yeah, really. I mean, a chamfer in an engineering term is just a means to be able to take away the edge, to take away the corner from between two surfaces, a vertical and a horizontal surface.
All right.
I guess a chamfer is probably the better English term to describe what it actually is. Angling is something which is very French. Is the term that is used.
All right.
But a chamfering, I mean, if you say angling or chamfering, it is basically the same thing, but in horology, it has become, angling is the term that is most prevalent.
So that would basically come from the French terminology anglage.
I guess so.
Yeah.
I guess so. There's a lot of nuances. So, I mean, angling is also an English word. I think when I first began, we would use like beveling, was right. Also, I think we said beveling more than anything else to create a bevel between the two surfaces. Today, angling probably becomes more prevalent because of the French.
Right.
Okay. So that's the angling. You see those images here. Okay. And the jig, like in the picture here with the woman holding the jig, the jigs, to be really efficient when these pieces are being angled on in large quantities. And these pictures come from a study that I did at Volsheet Manufacturer. Volsheet Manufacturer is the same company that produces watches originally for Richard Mille, that produces the watches for Parmigiani Watch Company, I think also for Hermes, and for a number of other companies as well. So they're one of the highest quality producers of movements made in any kind of volume. So they have everything industrialized very, very effectively to be able to generate something which is actually maintains a high quality, but is produced in quantity. What you're looking at there is a small bridge which fits flush into a jig, which allows the bridge to be easily manipulated, to try to make the job as simple as possible so that it takes as least time as possible, and the person can actually execute a very functional, quick, good quality job.
So I think the point to be also sort of thrown across to the audience that we have, that please understand, even to just hold a bridge and to just even angle it out, you have to vertically integrate into even specializing your own tooling, so it's not like movement is a different thing, but I think even the tooling has to be done sort of in a custom manner to even join up like the flush that you see between the jig and the bridge is absolutely minimal.
Completely. You can cut corners in a sense, and you can use just random pieces of metal. Sometimes people will even just try to hold the component to be able to then do the necessary polishing. But
Right.
ultimately, the easier you make it, the better the job you can do. And it's quite often a false economy to try to avoid doing that. And if you're on any kind of industrial level, or you're producing any kind of real numbers and not just making a unique piece, it's really practical to be able to actually make these kind of jigs. Everything takes time, so the better you can actually, the better your tools are, the quicker you can actually execute that job. So tool making is really part of watchmaking, whether or not that's in a large company or a small company. And if you look, just as a sideline, if you look at any experienced watchmaker's bench, you'll see that they have always modified half a dozen or a dozen or more of their tools. There's not, even though a screwdriver may be a standard screwdriver, you may actually have the same size. For example, you may have the same diameter of screwdriver blade, but the watchmaker will have 5 of them. And the reason for that is that each of the blades, even though they're the same diameter, the thickness at the end will be different to be able to compensate for the thickness in different, the screw head, sorry, the slot of the screw head. Because if you slip or you damage anything, it can be not only expensive, but highly time consuming. So when I recall when I was at Renan Pappy, I had just that. I had one size of screwdriver, but the actual slot, the slots were different on the screws. So we would all modify the screwdrivers. That's a tiny example of one thing. People modify jigs, they modify tweezers, they modify things to the job at hand, and they also modify them to how they feel comfortable. So generally speaking, you're not going to have 2 watchmakers who will actually have exactly the same variety of tools actually sitting on their benches. There's often no right way of doing something. You just got to get the right result. So what works for one person will not necessarily work for another.
Interesting.
Okay, so if I move up, okay, the next thing here is spotting. Okay, sometimes called engine turning in different industries, which in watchmaking is something altogether. So basically what it is here, and it's clearer on the right-hand image, you have a plate which is then held onto a base. And the inside of that drill that you see, there's a carborundum rubber stick. And that stick, I think somewhere else I can see it clearer, that stick has a flat end, and then the jig upon which the piece is made, she turns slowly, so that every time she turns by the half the thickness or half the diameter of that stick, she lowers it, and then it is effectively spotting or graining, decorating that plate. It's super, super simple. I don't know if you remember, like you've seen early aircraft, they would have it on the fuselage as well. You have it in cars, on the dashboard. It's exactly the same concept, but in watchmaking, it is done on a much smaller level. It can be done industrially, but often really the nicest results are done by hand, because that end section, that carborundum charged rubber section, often has to be redressed on a regular basis to keep it clean and free from being impregnated by the actual material.
So, Peter, just one quick thing I want to sort of clarify for the audience here. So she's taking aid of machine over here, okay? But doesn't she have to control the pressure every time that she sort of puts the surface of the rubber onto the metal?
Yep, absolutely. I mean, it's a semi-automated process, but ultimately she's moving up and down. She's actually orientating the position of the surface. And it is really down to her pressure, the pressure that she applies onto the tool, the final result. If she doesn't go hard enough, it just won't give a nice finish. If she goes too hard, then she'll actually block up the cutting surface on the carborundum charged rubber. So And she will also feel, you feel at a given moment in time, whether or not the actual end of that piece of material, it becomes actually clogged up, which is why it is, I mean, that is a very manual, it's a very manual intensive process. Different companies do things differently. It can be automated and you don't have to use the same material. Some people will use almost wood, which has paper sections at the end. There are more techniques and there are more ways and more tools in executing this particular process than I know of. But the one that you're seeing here is really one of the most traditional. And that is done like that, whether you're talking about small numbers, I mean, of like tens of pieces or unique pieces, or going up into, as is shown here with Vorche, going into thousands of pieces. If it's a main plate and they're literally doing thousands of movements, there are other ways of doing it which can be quicker. But I think with what we're looking at here, this is something which is probably done in hundreds of examples, and to maintain the kind of quality which they're actually aiming for, it is done in this semi-automated fashion.
All right.
Okay. All right, straight graining. Okay, I'll move past the straight graining. Well, since we're here, okay, so that is a spring on the top section. Okay, here in these images, what the lady is doing is that she's put that spring onto the block that she's holding, and she's just dragging it towards herself. The lines which are on that sandpaper, which is what looks like a 15 micron sandpaper, there's lots of different coarsenesses or thicknesses of these papers. You can have them which are literally like glass paper you find in carpentry or metalwork, all the way through to papers which almost feel smooth. And the coarser they are, the more aggressive or the more material that they remove. So that particular paper produced by 3M, it is 15 micron, which is relatively coarse. It is then sticky back, so it's glued onto a marble. They use a marble bed, and then she places the spring onto the jig, and then she's dragging it down in one direction to ensure that she gets a nice, clean, straight-grained effect.
And I mean, looking at this, probably it could be a setting lever spring or something like that, Peter.
It looks like it, completely, yeah.
So
looks like
just to here we have a magnified version of it, but just to give them a perspective, would it be the size of a human eyelash?
I think that probably thicker. The total length of what you're looking at is probably about 10 millimeters. And the thickest section of it towards the end is probably about 3/10 of a millimeter, something like that. 3 to 4/10 of a millimeter, 3/10 of a millimeter, I would say, something like that. So what you see there, that whole technique is done by hand, okay? And it's really the direction of the straight grain is completely influenced by the person pulling it down. The next section is a little bit different. It's the same thing, but on this one, if you see in the center there, you have that blue tool and there's a roller on it.
Yes.
And with that one, the woman there, she's actually placing a component on that square jig. That jig will then be placed into the center of the tool. And then under her arm, you have a long metal rectangular piece with two handles on. Underneath that handle, there'll be the same kind of paper. And what she will do is she will lay that tool, the steel tool, the rectangular plate, on top of the blue jig, and then she will pull it down. It'll move, so it can only go in one axis, and that way, without any need for
connection. So she'll
Pardon?
do it this way.
Say that again.
I said, so she'll sort of take that she'll take that metal strip and move it just over the component.
Yeah, but it's guided by the two rollers on that tool. Okay,
right.
So it's a more. This would be a technique if they're really producing. If they're doing thousands of the same thing, then they could actually use that technique. So it's semi-automated. So, but it's clean. There's actually a vacuum pump which is inside of this thing to pull the jig down. I'm not sure, it may even actually suck away the grains that are produced from the actual process as well. Okay, so if I move.
I mean, looking like as you're scrolling through, I'm just going to put another question to you. Like when we look at brands like Langer, and they say that they're, you know, that the movements are decorated by hand and can be identified to which person actually did a particular movement. Uh, would the process be similar? Would it be automated? Would it be semi-automated or completely traditional?
I'm always reluctant to talk or comment on companies that I haven't directly worked with.
All right, so talk.
No. I mean, it's like sometimes you can tell, but the only people who can differentiate. I won't use Lang & Sanner as an example, but when I was at Renault Pappy, and we were a workshop of about 12 people, you literally could see, there was a feeling, you could actually work out who did what. It was almost like a feeling. It was just like an angling which was just a fraction bigger from somebody else, something which was a little, the cleanliness which was on another level, the polish which was just that much, I won't say better, but slightly different from somebody else.
Okay.
But with a company like Lang, I mean, you can probably have a better idea of defining who did what when we talk about really unique or small series pieces, where you have a workshop of 2, 3, or 4 people doing the same piece, and then they probably will leave a certain imprint on the piece if they are doing the decoration.
Okay.
But most of the companies that are doing these watches, that are producing any kind of volume, it's very rare that it's actually the watchmaker that does the decorating, for very practical reasons. If a watchmaker is trained to make watches, to assemble, to adjust, to finish, to build, when it comes to the angling, which is a very time-consuming and specialized process, usually you have a decorations department with people who spend all their days doing it. They have their jigs, they have their tools, and that is their expertise. So from a sort of a commercial point of view, and also the people who do that all of the time do it very, very well.
Right.
So often it makes more sense that that is actually done by a specialized workshop. There's always exceptions. But when you have a company like Langer that does produce a certain volume, at least for the watches that they make in quantities, in larger quantities, it's unlikely that you're going to be able to differentiate one watch from another person, I would imagine.
All right.
Okay. So this is cool. Sorry, I've actually haven't looked at these images for quite a long time. So this is just finishing off the straight graining. So here you have the jig. It's actually held onto the blue tool by vacuum. You've got a series of components which are all laid on top, secured in place by pins. Then you have the 3M paper, and then that. Okay, there you go. Just running down. Okay, so when we go further down, then that piece is then laid on top of it between the 2 rollers, moved backwards and forwards, and all of the components are grained at the same time. So it's a certain sort of industrialization, but there's still handwork involved in the whole process. It's one of the fascinating things about watchmaking is that even when you have elements like mainsprings, which are produced by a company like General Resort, who produce over 3 million a year, when you go into the factory, you still see an awful lot of intervention, manual intervention that takes place in the production. Okay, so I'll carry on with the dressing. Okay, so that's kind of step 1. Okay, I'll move on to the next one because I could quite easily put everybody into a coma by talking about angling and graining. Okay, the next one down is guilloche. Can you see that?
Yes.
The guilloche. So guilloche or guillochage, or this is in English we would normally call engine turning, has existed for a very, very long period of time. Okay, and this study, which is made on the site, was actually done most of this was actually orchestrated by Daniela, and the woman who actually does, Brittany Cox, who does restoration and guilloche turning. I think she's in Canada. I'm not quite sure where she is. Hang on, I go to the bottom.
New York based, right?
Here you go. Pardon?
Isn't she New York based?
I can't remember. I honestly can't remember. American. She's got here. Well, this was published in the American Institute of Conservation, but she's on that side of the water.
Right.
Hang on. She's American. I'd say Daniela just for me. She's an antiquarian horologist.
Right.
So she put this together. With Daniela for us, and it gives you a little bit of an idea of where guilloche comes from. And it's a process that has been around for a very long time. And if you think of breguet, quite often breguet is synonymous with this. And if you ever have the opportunity,
all their dials are exquisitely guillochaged.
One more time.
The dials, mainly the engine turn dials,
Yes.
quite a signature with breguet.
Absolutely. And also a lot of guilloche was used on the side of early pocket watches for very practical reasons, because it made them less slippery, gave a certain grip to them. Right. So if you go onto the Naked Watchmaker and you look at the breguet section and you look at the pocket watches, they tend to, not always, but you tend to have the edges which are actually decorated with guilloche. And it is a decoration. It does avoid having fingerprints on the pieces, but it also, there's a practical element that the pieces actually, you're less likely to actually drop them. So there's both a combination of pragmatism, practical use, as well as the aesthetics as well. So this is kind of an interesting one, because you have a whole bunch of ways to guilloche. Today, you have the traditional engine turning machines, which is what breguet uses as a company. But then you have other companies that can use different laser technologies. Even 100 years ago, companies like Cartier were using stamping to replicate the impression of guilloche on their early pocket watches. And they had to do it because they were making very slim watches, and the dials were under 0.3 of a millimeter thick, and there wasn't the room for traditional guilloche. And they ended up making stamped out guilloche dials, which were absolutely beautiful. They're just a different technique. You also have another option of making guilloche dials today, whereby you can make an original using a rose cutting engine. And then there are different systems of reproducing, copying that original dial to within a degree of precision that it is impossible to tell the difference between something which has been made by hand and something which has actually been made by or reproduced by a machine. You can tell what is nice and what is not nice, what is good and what is poor. But ultimately, it is impossible to be able to differentiate that which is original to that which has actually been produced in any kind of volume.
So, can we say that the engine turning and producing of the guillochage effect, can that be replicated by stamping, or are they completely poles apart?
No, they can be reproduced by stamping. I mean, you can. There are companies out there that will that have the ability to be able to replicate both engine turning, as well as engraving. I mean, to the degree, and it's actually an expensive process, but you can take either a highly complex engine turned dial, or a hand engraved dial. And a hand engraved dial, for example, that may have spent, an engraver may have spent months working on, and will cost tens of thousands of dollars. And you can scan it. The technology exists to be able to scan the dial, scan the engine turning, scan the engraving, and then to be able to reproduce it using different forms of machining. So the technology today makes it really virtually impossible to be able to recognize that which has been done by a guilloche, an engine turning machine, and that which has been done by modern manufacturing techniques.
As you said that, do you remember you using that example, saying that while we were in the workshop, we could sort of distinguish each other's signature work, from that little little difference in graining or the
Yeah.
polish.
Yeah.
Is there a sort of a practical tip that you can share with us where one can see to differentiate between the engine turned or the hand engraved? Is that a possibility?
Honestly, not, because the differences are so incredibly subtle. I think that this is where I would say that the only way that you can really know is not through the watch, but is actually trust in the brand, the company, the person who actually produces it. For example, if you go to Breguet, it's a very big thing with them. You'll see the engine turning workshop, which is massive, and it is always running at capacity, and there are people who have been there forever. And you know that they as a company produce their own dials. There may be people who will actually argue my point, but I have seen reproductions of original engine turned dials using a rose cutting engine. And those reproductions, which are basically copies, are absolutely perfect, to the point whereby the only way you will know a series of pieces are not original, or at least not made by engine turning, is if there is an error, if there is a fault somewhere, that fault will also be copied along with the rest of the dial. So if you have, say, a series of 10 or 100 dials, all looking original, but they all have the same slightly quirky error, fault, scratch, mark, defect on them, that can then lead you to believe that those pieces are actually produced in series using modern technology, opposed to being made individually by a rose cutting engine.
Oh, that's an interesting point.
Okay. So it's a different there, and it's not, and I'm not even critical of it, because ultimately one of the most important things is the final result, and that's what we're looking for, is to find something which is high quality, which is not always easy to define, but something which has that beauty to it. What is an interesting project that I saw recently, and I think it was on the random blog in Time, was if you check out, I think it's in the random blog in Time, there was a collaboration recently made between the brand Schwarz-Etienne and Kari Voutilainen. Kari Voutilainen not only made the dials for the brand Schwarz-Etienne, but he also did the guilloche work on the bridges. And that I know factually, that everything that you see there was made, all the guillochage, all the engine turning, that was made by Kari. It's clean, sharp, beautiful, and it's like 100% done by him in his workshop, in the traditional way.
And hence the $30,000 price tag on a steel watch.
If you buy the same watch, I actually said the same thing to him. Okay, it's funny you should say that. And I said the same thing to him. But if you look at what Kari makes when it's under his own name, it's twice the price.
Yes.
As well. So the argument from Schwarz-Etienne, which I concur to, because I'm a fan of the brand, is that they can have a part of Kari on a high quality manufactured caliber made by Schwarz-Etienne. So in a sense, from one perspective, it's inexpensive. Okay, it's always a lot of money, but it is something which is a nice collaboration to make a limited series of pieces between two companies that I personally have a high regard for.
Now, speaking of companies, and during your time at Audemars Piguet, we have a question saying that, are the tapestry dials by Audemars Piguet a form of engine turning as well? I believe they still use a pantograph to make these.
Tapestry, I don't even know what that is.
The Royal Oak series, they have that waffle kind of a dial. The effect.
Oh goodness.
Yeah.
Oh, I don't know that. When I was with Renan Papi Audemars Piguet, we worked building all of the repeaters, the repeaters, the tourbillons, the grand sonneries. We never did those kind of watches. Yeah. So, but I I don't know. I really don't know. I mean, I would make the assumption because they were made in such large quantities that they were made using more industrial techniques rather than engine turning,
Right.
probably stamped out or machined by CNC. I can't imagine that they would make something like that using traditional engine turning.
So while you've used a good example of Kari's collaboration with Schwartz Ethine, we have another question saying that apart from Breguet, which does these high quality engine turn dials, who's the other high grade brand with with that kind of geoshark capabilities?
Oh my goodness. Wow. Listen, almost every high quality brand in some way or another has used guilloche, have used engine turned elements in their watches, because it is, although it is synonymous with Breguet, it is a form of decoration that has been used for whatever hundreds of years.
Mm-hmm.
The one that stands out, I can think of two, although one doesn't really even exist anymore, but they're both linked. Breguet is like the ultimate one, because it's really part of their DNA as a brand. And the other one was actually Daniel Roth, when they existed. And
Right.
Daniel Roth as a brand, I mean, Daniel was actually part of the team who regenerated Breguet when it was at the point of extinction. And then when he went solo, and he's an important guy because he was one of him and the people around him that produced Daniel Roth, was really one of the reasons that this new generation of independent watchmakers actually emerged in the first place. But that's another story. The relevant thing is that he, and even today with a few pieces that Daniel makes, he still uses that, and he's kind of adopted that as part of his own DNA. But when it comes to other companies or one other company, I don't have one other company. The one which is the most important from a historical point of view, I would say, is Breguet. After that, you'll find examples of guilloche by virtually every company, both of a high quality and also of a low quality.
Interesting.
Okay, so I'll get rid of that page. Move on to...
While you're finding another page, I'm just going to share with a gentleman based out of India called Amish, who's quite a guru on watches himself. So he shares with us that surprisingly, or not, depending upon how much one is in love with the brand, the Patek's new 6007 also has a stamped guillochage ring. So apart from the manufacturers like Frederic Constant at the lower end, even brands like Patek are restoring to machining of guillochage.
Listen, I mean, at the end of the day, and I have no doubt that what the gentleman is saying is correct, but at the end of the day, the technologies that are available today are so extraordinary that whether something is laser cut, stamped, cut by a rose cutting engine, or copied by, there's other different systems which are out there, you can get extraordinary results. And there are people who are very specific about, or rather I'm trying to search for the word, but believe that things should be done in a particular way to get a particular result. It's very, very puritanical, and it's not maybe a bad thing, but I can't help also thinking that the most important thing is the final result. If I can give just a sort of justification for that, we never talk about quality on the Naked Watchmaker, because quality is a completely subjective subject. You could have a company producing 100 watches a year. They're all hand finished. They have 100 complications, but half of the pieces, for whatever reason, don't work, or they come back, or there's an issue with them in after sales service. And then you have a company like Rolex or ETA or Swatch that are producing literally millions of watches, and the success rate is, or the functional rate of reliability is 95%. It's phenomenal, yet they are mass-produced pieces. And even if you compare between Swatch and Rolex, they're positioned differently, but they're all quite extraordinary when you consider the reliability of the final product. So we never tend to go into what is quality because it is such a subjective thing. Yeah. My own personal sort of feeling on many of these things is the final result. And the techniques that are used today, whether it is stamping or whether it's using an engine, a rose cutting engine, they can be pretty much identical or very, very close. When somebody buys a Carrie Wootalainen watch or a Roger Smith watch with an engine turned dial, there's a different story behind that, because people are buying those watches because they are buying part of the life of those people, and that's part of the deal. That's what you get. You're buying part of the life of an extraordinary watchmaker, and that process of guillochage is actually what people are buying. It's not stamping, it's actually who they are. So there are subtleties in the argument. When it comes to the big brands, it can be something different altogether.
Right. And of course, I mean, I think you summarized an extremely important point, which keeps bothering most of the watch aficionados and collectors is, should I be going for an absolute manufacturer movement, or should I be going for a third party, for a watch brand which has a third party installed movement? And of course, that's a very debatable aspect of things, but I think that summarization I'm sure will make a lot of sense and give some viewpoint to our viewers this evening. So let's continue with the next one that you have to share with us.
Okay, so the next one, do you see it? The making marquetry? Okay, all right. So Bastien, this is a complete contrast. Okay, Bastien is a young man. I think he's probably not older than 30 years old. He lives in Sainte-Croix, near to Rouge and Yanni Halter, in the Neuchâtel Mountains. And he's one of only, I don't know, of 2 or 3 people who does what he actually does. So marquetry has been around in furniture for hundreds of years, and he comes from a furniture background, but he has adapted his talents to using hard woods to be able to produce extraordinary dials, as you see here. Only in tiny quantities. One of his, I mean, he's worked for Parmigiani, he's worked for Vacheron, and there's no shame with those companies that they've used somebody on the outside, because this is so specialized that there's only so few people out there who can do this kind of thing, that you take them whenever you can find them. Because if you want to have something like this, then the number of living souls on this planet who can execute this kind of work you can count on less than one hand. So this is Parmigiani. So what is, just to go into the process, he cuts everything out using piercing saws. He finishes all the edges by hand using sandpaper. He then effectively cements all of the different pieces together on a hard disk. And then if you look at this one here with the tourbillon, once all the pieces are finished, then the dial is handed to the manufacturer, and the manufacturer will then cut out the hole for the tourbillon, for the power reserve, and adding all of the indexes and doing the printing afterwards. So it's a very artisanal process. That's a nice one. That's a nice example there, because there you see the dial as he's made it, and then that dial as it stands would have been given to Parmigiani, and then afterwards Parmigiani will then do all the final machining on CNC to be able to add all of the additional elements to it before the watch is then the dial is then cased up.
So safe to say that he would be the, like how Anita Porsche is for enamel dials, would Bastien be the one for marquetry?
I think he probably would. I only know of one other person who does work to this quality, and it's actually a woman who is based in Paris, and they know each other. They're all these people. They don't consider each other as competition, although they really are. They're all friends. And the difference with the other person is that Bastien tends to work only in wood, and she will use wood and ceramic, metal. She uses mother of pearl, other elements. Whereas Bastien, I think, tends to concentrate just on different types of wood. That's really his speciality. And there they are. You get an idea of the different materials that he actually uses. But yeah, but there's, I mean, it's a super specialized, super expensive process, because every time he does one of these things, there's a lot of time involved. I mean, it's a huge one. Okay, so there's Bastien. He also does this artwork, and the boxes which are in front of him there, that's actually, I think, for Vianney Halter as well. That's for one of his watches.
Oh, it's pretty interesting.
He's lovely, and literally his studio then backs onto his little room where he sleeps, and it's all very simple. It's all very basic, and he lives and breathes what he does. I mean, and on top of all of that, he's an absolutely wonderful young guy. There you go.
So,
Oh,
essentially, Peter, I mean, like the dial that we have on our screen over here right now, okay? How much time does it take the young man to actually, from start to finish? I mean, how many man hours are we looking at?
You know, I think I asked him that. It may even be written down here, but I know the answer that these guys give you is never accurate, because they never keep full track of the amount of time that they spend. They don't work, as it were, like normal hours. These guys aren't doing 9 to 5. They start and they keep on working until it's finished. Wow. I mean, it's like, if I was to say 2 or 3 weeks, that we're not probably talking about 2 or 3 40-hour weeks. And those weeks probably don't have 5 days. They probably go to 6 or 7 days as well. So it's kind of a passion deal with these things. So, I mean, it goes into weeks, but what kind of week, I can't define. And I'm not convinced that they know themselves, because they put so much energy, so much effort into what they do.
What are the types of wood that normally they would use in something like this? Like, we have a question from one of our people over here. Karishma has raised a question saying that the wood veneer, is the wood veneer the usual go-to material for marquetry work?
He uses, and I'm pretty sure it's noted here somewhere, different. I know that the basic priority of the wood, hang on, hardwood and incredibly brittle, and the other soft are both great challenges. I know that the stuff, what he uses, it has to be hard. It's specialized, I kind of remember, like rosewood. There are different materials that he purchased. Here we go. Walnut, maple, stained, tulip wood, burr, myrtle, pearwood. I didn't even know half of these things actually exist. But it is a specialized domain. He has to have stuff which is hard. Otherwise, because of the scale of it, it just falls apart. And then once the whole thing is actually then fixed together, I believe that they do use a form of, I think the French call it zaponage, or it's like a form of lacquer, which then goes over the top of everything, which then seals it all and protects it. It protects it from sun. So it seals it for posterity, so that the thing has a lifetime. Right. And also it is giving it some form of protection, so that if the thing is actually left in direct sunlight for long periods of time, it isn't going to fall apart.
So essentially, would this be a recognized way to treat the wood, or since the artist is so unique, he would have his secret recipe into sort of the treatment of the wood, which actually, makes his work unique apart from the hand skills?
He will, I'd say that each one of those dials is part of him. So he will have developed, as with the watchmaker, his own techniques in getting that final result.
Right.
If you sat him next to the Parisian woman who does the same thing, I would put money on it that you'd see parallels in what they do, but an entirely different collection of tools and techniques, because everybody's different, and this is something which is very human. It's very personal.
Okay.
And ultimately, they are all leaning towards achieving a certain result. And that result is defined by techniques that come from the individuals. They have to find them. They have to work those things out along the way. And what, like with the watchmaking, what works for one person does not necessarily work for somebody else. It really comes down to what that result is.
Right.
Okay. So I will get rid of that one. Marquetry. Okay, the tool room. Okay, so every large manufacturer, okay, has a tool room. Okay, the tool room is where jigs are made, tools are modified, are constructed. You have lathes, you have milling machines, you have pointers. You have everything that is required to make all of the tools necessary, which are then used in mass production. But all of those tools that you find in a tool room are actually the same tools that you find in an artisanal workshop. Because to make a basic watch, you need a jig, you need a lathe, you need a milling machine, you need a pointers, and that is effectively the same structure for both a tool room and an artisanal workshop, except one produces volume and one produces the contrary, a handful of pieces. So the tool room you see here, so the Chauvelin 70, the grinding machines, the Hauser, the pointers, all of these things which are producing the jigs, which are shown below, can also be used to make the final components. So this is kind of like one of the differentiating things between a large company and a small company.
Right.
And that's a funny thing. That's actually a demagnetizer, which is probably about half a century old. So if they're producing tools, jigs, which become magnetized in the process of being machined, then they stick them inside of this coil, this coil wrapped copper sort of Frankenstein device, and press the button, and then they pull it out, and then it will become demagnetized.
Yeah. The modern demagnetizers that we use in the watch workshops are like they fit in the palm of your hand.
Yeah. It's a very different thing. But those ones, if you have a large tool which is heavily magnetized, that they won't do the job. So if you have something big, I mean, you can basically, with what you're looking at, you can stick your hand in there. You could stick a hammer in there. You could stick a very large item through it, and then you put it through it. You stick the item inside. You press the button, an AC current runs through it, and then as you pull out the piece, it completely changes the orientation of the magnetic field within it. So it comes out completely demagnetized. If you were to put a watch through this thing, you'd probably kill it. Okay, so I'll move on to the next one. Artisanal, which is...
I think Peter will have to go a little bit fast.
Okay, so tell me what you want to address, because otherwise I'm losing track of time, because well, that's what I do. I lose track of time when I start talking about this stuff.
Yeah, but I think we're already about an hour.
You want to open up for some questions?
Sure, go ahead. Much easier.
Yeah.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi. Very, very honored to be there and absolutely thrilled to listen to you, Sir Speake Marin. I'm a very humble watch creator. I have no watchmaking formal training like SOP or something like this you mentioned. But sometimes I'm discussing with clients and they are talking about the frontier about handmade, while today as watch creator or watchmaker, we're using quite modern tools. And I usually say you would consider like a very standard saw, like a hand tool for handmade. But for example, laser has to be operated and programmed by hand and is also a tool. So it's always like a big argument between the handmade in the old and respected fashion, when you have the tools you can hold in the hand, and the tools that today you're programming with the hand. And I wanted to have your point of view of this, because your background and your work has been through decades, and you've seen this much more than I do, for example.
It is a really gray zone, because ultimately the only thing which is really done by hand is assembly and maybe decoration. Every component, whether it's a pinion, a screw, a bridge, a main plate, there is always intervention which requires machines. Perhaps what one can say is that if a component or if a watch is actually produced that is not requiring CNC machining, maybe at that point we can say that the quantity of time required by somebody to make that watch is so large that you can say that it is handmade. But you're never going to get a definitive, there's no right answer to it. You can have a watch which is entirely manufactured using modern techniques, which never is touched by a person until the final assembly. And then you're sitting at a bench and that person is actually assembling the piece. So I don't have a simple answer for you. There are too many gray zones within the potential answers. I kind of think that the most important thing from if you have a watchmaker who's making watches, one of the most important parts of what he makes is that and Sarosh may have heard me say this before, but a watchmaker who is a real watchmaker, who is actually making his own watches, the final product, the final watch that that person makes is a representation of that individual, of that watchmaker. And in the same way as you can have 1,000 artists and every artist will make something which is different from the next person along, it's the same thing with a watchmaker. So that variation is a result of the individual. And I kind of think that's probably more important than did the person spend 10 hours, 100 hours, 1,000 hours? Is the actual product, is the watch authentic to the individual? Or is it just another product on the market? So if you, as a creator or as a watchmaker, produce something which really comes from you, something which comes from your love, your passion, from your own creativity, it is something that is going to define itself. Afterwards, how much time you put into it in actually executing the final piece, it's impossible to define at what point you say it's handmade. I think it's more important that it's something which is a representation of the individual. And the other point is how you position the product at the end of it. Meaning, is the intrinsic value of that product in relation to the actual product and the price, are they actually in the same ballpark, or are they not aligned? Does that make sense?
It makes absolutely sense, and I totally agree on what you said. It's a very, very nice definition that I keep in mind.
Thank you for the question. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Anyone,
other?
any other questions for Peter? Okay, so I have one, Peter. Peter, remember when we were discussing a little earlier on, and when we spoke of the Côte de Genève finish, and you had mentioned in correlation to how you would see it from Philippe Dufour's workshop, and compared to what a commercial brand would do. Can you give me that little insight?
Okay, so one of the elements which would define kind of like a high quality Geneva stripe and a lesser quality Geneva stripe is the juncture between the surface and the angling. So when you look with an eyeglass, or you do need an eyeglass to be able to differentiate it, the angles, the actual Côte de Genève, the stripes, when they actually hit the edge of the bridge, they shouldn't then create steps into the angling. If they do, it doesn't mean that it's bad or wrong. That depends on the price point of the actual product. It's just not indicative of the highest quality that can be made. When you look at companies, and I think probably Lang & Söhne are an example of this, people like, another company would be somebody like Roman, goodness me, Gautier, yeah, who does exceptionally beautiful pieces as well. There are certain watchmakers, brands who produce things onto a very, very high level. And Dufour is one of the most beautiful examples because he does do things by hand. And you see that you have that beautiful finish of the Geneva stripe, and then you have beautiful angling. Everything is sharp, everything is clean. There are no steps, and you have a clarity in the final finishing. So it's kind of like the most sumptuous, delicious, from a watchmaking point of view, form of finishing. And you really, that is something which you do not see every day on every product.
Okay, that's good. I'm going to direct this question a little more personal to you rather than the naked watchmaker. I know of the fact that every watchmaker in training, and by the time they are graduating, they contribute their own one special piece, which is known as a school watch. Did you also make one?
No, not really. When I went to school in Hackney Technical College, we made a clock, not a watch. We made a brass A-frame, weight-driven pendulum clock over the 2 years that we were actually there. And part of the reason was that at that time, and the college hasn't existed now for probably 20 years, was that you went into Hackney Technical College and most of the students didn't know what they were going to do, or their direction was very diverse. Some went into watches, some went into clocks, some went into making, others into restoration. So the basic course was generalistic. And when you make a clock, you still use all of the techniques that you use for everything. So presently, I have an A-frame clock sitting in my mum's place in the middle of Wales right now. But no, it wasn't, sadly, it wasn't actually a wristwatch or a pocket watch for that matter.
All right.
So Peter, which is the next watch you want to deconstruct?
I'm presently in the process of doing it. And I think it's okay to talk about because it's going to be published soon. And it's the Parmigiani Hijri Quantium Perpetual, which is like nothing I've ever seen before. It is based on the Islamic calendar. It is governed by the lunar change, the lunar calendar opposed to the solar calendar. It was based on a clock that Parmigiani built in about 2011, I believe. And it has a different number of days in a year. It has different numbers of days in a month as well. And one of the wonderful surprises with this thing was that I had no idea what to expect when I took off the dial. And under the dial, you have crescent moon shaped bridges. You have the Hijri 8-starred, like two crossing squares actually built into the watch, and it's phenomenal. It's absolutely beautiful. And that's the one I'm doing right now. And that one I think should theoretically come out at the end of the month, along with possibly a vintage Navitimer from 1966. But there's lots more. We constantly have pieces which are in the process of being done.
Great.
I think the best way for all our viewers over here would be to sort of just go onto your website and register their email so that they would always get an update when you have more content over.
Absolutely.
All right.
Absolutely.
All right.
I have a question.
Yes.
Okay. Hi. What's up?
Hey, Mr. Matrix, how you doing?
Yeah, I got your red pill, blue pill joke before. That was pretty good. Yeah. So the question I had was this is kind of cliche, but I mean, since you have a lot of experience in this and adjusted to modern technology, where do you see it going in the future? Because it went from being a tool to a luxury. So it would be pretty helpful to know where you personally see watchmaking in the future, or even if it exists at some point. So yeah.
Watchmaking as a profession will always be there, in the same way as artists will always be there, because human beings, as their sort of our nature is that we don't have just what we need, but we have things that we want, which actually add culture to our lives. Paintings, food, things which actually enrich, which create a certain emotion within us. Okay, that's what differentiates us from animals or from machines. So the first thing is that it will always be there. Okay, I think in the future there's going to probably be more value, in a sense, because it's not just brand value, but the real value, the real intrinsic value of what you're buying. Okay, because that's something that didn't always exist, but is existing more. When it comes to the actual techniques, I think that whether it's 5, 10, or 20 years down the road, you're going to have the opportunity. Anybody could basically make their own watch, because you're going to have forms of high precision 3-dimensional printers that you can literally have in your kitchen, and you'll be able to make a pinion, a wheel, a bridge. Doesn't mean that it will work, doesn't mean it will look good, doesn't mean it will have any value, but workshops will, even like a small artisanal workshop, won't just have a lathe, drilling machine, pointers, but they will actually have the ability to design easily, because the software is so user-friendly, to be able to make anything which is actually missing. And that will both create a lot of rubbish in the market, but it will also mean that you probably have a lot more innovation and a lot of extraordinary things, which are the result of people who don't realize that it shouldn't work, but it does, because they've tried it. If you get my drift, I think it will open up a lot of ingenuity, because people will try things and stumble across solutions that otherwise would not have been imagined in the first place. But I think the technology is going to change it even further. It already has done over the last 20 years. And 3D printing, electroformage, all these techniques are only going to develop more and more in the future.
I think some of the guys have already started visualizing what they would make if they had to make. Oh, yeah. All right.
Any more questions, guys? Anyone? Go for it.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Hi, Peter. Thank you so much for taking us through this. It's been a journey so far, and so we have a large audience here who's based out of India, and I can tell you we're not shy to say that we are value hunters. Okay, and I don't want the word value to be mixed with cheap, rather. Okay, so from your experience, okay, from the mainstream brands, all right, which brands do you feel, bring the best value, to a watch enthusiast, like.
You've just disappeared. I can't hear anybody.
Yeah, I think, but we got the question. Yeah,
Okay.
Virat, you're back?
Yeah, I got disconnected.
Okay.
So yeah, I was basically asking that, based on your experience, you probably have a lot more insight going into the tool rooms, you know, and the manufacture. So
I get you. I get you. Listen, it's an impossible question to answer. It would be a really easy question, or easier question, if you were talking about tooling, or I don't know, food or restaurants. But the thing is with watchmaking, it's an emotional thing. People don't buy any watch because they have to have it. They don't need to have it. They buy it because they want to have it. And then afterwards, I think human beings buy things for two reasons. I mean, one of the first things is that, does it actually speak to them on an emotional level? Okay, but then they want to be able to validate the final purchase by an academic, intellectual justification that it's actually worth what they are paying for it. And there are companies whose brand value exceeds dramatically the quality of the product. Whether it will be like that in 10 years' time, 20 years' time, in a year's time, it's impossible to say, because everything changes and it will always be the way. It's the only constant is that everything changes. So the value is really is perceived from my perspective by what you want. There are companies that make incredible products and are, relatively speaking, inexpensive, and others which are not as good, much more expensive, and sell much more. I won't enter into that kind of answer, because it doesn't actually associate to why people buy watches in the first place. And I'm not trying to avoid the question, it's just not possible. If you look at a basic Rolex, okay, they are absolutely incredible. Okay, if you're talking about the value of it, technical value, they're incredibly well made. From a functional point of view, there's probably nothing really out there which actually beats them. And they produce, I don't know what the numbers are today, but at one point it was like 800 to 1 million pieces a year, and they would still release pieces which would be selling for a premium. How do they do that? I mean, that's pure genius at the end of it. And then you have other companies. There's a company called Crepus. Okay, the watches are about 400 to 500 euro. There's a couple who make them out of Spain, and they are absolutely beautiful as well. But it's an entirely different animal. I don't know what to recommend when it comes to modern watchmaking. There is so much diversity. There is so much value, and not as well. But I do think that in the future that the whole value deal is actually going to just improve. I think it has to, because partly maybe because of us, because we show people what is true, and people want to know more today about how things work. Not just what does the brand say, but is the product real? Does it have validity? And whether it's with us or through other people, you can learn. And that will mean that things have to be authentic. They have to have validity. But ultimately, the value proposition on pieces, I think it comes down to, is it what you want? Does it actually ring the bell that you want to be sounded at the end of it? It's too emotional and subjective a business to be able to answer objectively. And it's not, the question is totally valid. And it's not just you as a market, an Indian market, everybody poses the same question. But I see people who are super bright, super intelligent, and then they go and spend a packet of cash on something which I think is completely insane. But they love it, and they know what they're buying. But their reasons for buying it are not necessarily based on reason. They're based on the fact that they want to have it because they can, and because they're passionate about it. Reason at that point goes completely out of the window.
Thank you for that. I mean, I think that question which Viranchi asked was resonating with a lot of us, and I think you put it up very well. And to understand the whole emotional, also obviously there is an emotional connect with the watch before you buy it. So Ankur, we'll have your question. I think it should be the last one for the evening. We're going way ahead of time.
All right. Thanks. Thank you, Puneet. Thanks, Peter, for your time today.
Hey,
can you hear me?
I can hear you.
But I have two quick questions. In the recent video that you did with Mark at the Watches TV, you were speaking highly of Grand Seiko. I wanted to check with you, is there anything different or unique that Grand Seiko does with the finishing that makes it very different from the other brands? The outer finishing or the internal movement finishing? And the second question is, second quick question, you played a very important role during the founding of, maybe the founding of MBNF, right? You got a lot of watchmakers together, and I just wanted to know, how was the journey like, getting a lot of people together and working on and developing a brand, something very unique?
Okay. Okay, Seiko, Grand Seiko, okay? Grand Seiko go to real extremes when they actually, I cannot remember the terminology, but they have a specific kind of polishing process that they use for the cases. And I went to the factory and I saw how they did it. And it means that they get very high finishes, which are angular, like you would almost find on a watch bridge. The term, go to the website, you'll find it there.
I think it's Ziratsu that you're talking about.
You've got it. Somebody just put it up there. That's it. But it is beautiful, and it is one of those elements which actually define the exterior of the case. One of the things that defines the inside, which is actually very cool, is actually how they do their version of Geneva stripe. And it isn't really a Geneva stripe. Whereas all of the techniques that are used in this country use like abrasive compounds or paper or impregnated rubber. What they use is actually a cutting, like a diamond cutter, or a hard, I think it's actually diamond or tungsten carbide, I'm not quite sure which. So instead of using a flat piece of material at an angle to remove material, they are literally cutting. So it's a little bit like on an early vinyl record. It produces grooves, and they use that to cut away the material. It evens up the surface, it produces the decoration, and whether or not they cut through brass or tungsten on a rotor, for example, you have a consistent finish that actually traverses the whole of the material. And it's something which is like part of their DNA. Nobody tends to think about it or recognize it. And there's only one company in Switzerland that I'm aware of, and it's a small brand, Armstrong, that do the same thing, and they're making a handful of pieces. But that's one of the things which actually defines the aesthetics of Grand Seiko. So they're the two things in relation to the casing and the movement. In relation to MBNF, it's never about one person. I was part of it, and there was a lot of other people who were involved. When I did that, I helped other companies develop at the same time. And one of the things that I've always loved about watchmaking is the synergy of putting different people together to produce something that otherwise would never be produced. And at that point in history, and it was kind of a horological point in history, it was very new, it was very original. It started off with a series of watches being made for a German leather company whose name, Sarosh, can you remember the name of the company?
For what
Before, there was a company, not Seinfeld, there was a German leather company that commissioned a group of guys from the academy to produce a watch which was associated to them.
No.
Oh God, it's a long time ago now, but they were that company was the first company to actually bring a whole group of watchmakers together. They didn't work together, but they worked to be able to produce. Again? Goldfield, there you go, Goldfield, that was the one. Yeah. So Goldfield was a means whereby a brand actually brought independent watchmakers together separately, but to work with them. Then you had Max with Harry Winston and the Opus watches, and that was this combination of using credibility from watchmakers with an existing brand. Then Max went on his own, and he did MBNF, bringing again people together. And this is all a new period. This is it's a new step in watchmaking history. It happened, and then it's kind of over to a degree now. But to answer your question, the actual experience was extraordinary, because watchmaking is a very insular process quite often. And when you're working with different watchmakers, different suppliers, bringing everybody's talents together, You produce something that otherwise you would never have produced. One person wouldn't have done it because you have multiple ideas, heads, brains, spirits, souls, all being put into the same thing. And I must admit, I learned an awful lot, and I loved that period. Not only was I considerably younger than I am today, I love learning in the same way that I do the Naked Watchmaker, because by teaching, you learn along the route. When you are actually working with all those different people, you are absorbing everything that goes on around you. And I absolutely loved it. It was a great process. Okay. Thank you.
Cool. I think we are way over time now. And is there any other question, or maybe we can answer them later? What we'll do is I'll share Peter's email address, Peter, if you're okay with that. Or maybe I'll take the questions and maybe direct it to you later together. List of questions.
No problem.
Because I think...
someone here wants to know what watch Peter is wearing right now. You can't do that, Peter.
I'm doing exactly that because I knew somebody would pose that question. So no. I'm kind of like Mr. Neutral these days. Okay.
How Swiss.
Yeah, I'm very Swiss. I've been here for it's been over 20 years. I've become Swiss. I have no sense of humor anymore either. Okay. And I'm passionate about cows and milk and chocolate. Okay.
No, thank you so much, Peter. Thank you for taking the time to be with us this evening. Truly a memorable one, and we sure will look forward to having you once to elaborate more from what we can learn from you. Over to you, Puneet, so you can close the session for today.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. Thank you for enlightening us with so much knowledge, interesting stuff. In fact, I've got a lot of messages on my phone and also on this chat, on a private chat, that we need to have more sessions with Peter, because we are, it is really interesting to know some of those things, because we see it on the dial of the watch or maybe on the decoration of the movement, but what actually goes into that. And like Viranchi had put up the question, the value addition per se from an Indian mentality standpoint. Yeah. So all that came together, and it was really interesting to know everything from you. And thank you for your patience with coordinating with all of us to kind of get this together. And Sarosh, thank you very much. As usual, you've been a lot of help to us. And thank you for moderating this session, and also being, kind enough to kind of tone it down to what Peter was saying. But I think Peter was saying things which we could kind of understand.
Absolutely.
I mean, it is okay. So, and thank you everyone for joining. I think we've again gone way over time, which is fine. I think every session goes a little bit over time and no one really minds. But in everyone's interest, I would like to call it an end now to the session. And the session is getting recorded right now on the cloud. So in case anyone's interested, I can always share that with you guys. And in case of any questions for Peter, please, reach out to Bombay Watch Enthusiasts, and then we can just collate everything and send it to Peter once we have all our questions sorted.
That's the way to do it. Yeah, brilliant.
Perfect.
Okay, guys. Cool. It was lovely to have met you all.
See you then. Bye-bye, Peter.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye, guys.